Welcome to this Ivey Impact live session, Trade on Trial. What's at stake for Canadian business? I'm Julian Birkinshaw, Dean of the Ivey Business School. I'm excited to be your host for this critical and timely discussion on the future of US-Canada trade relations. As a business school, we feel a responsibility and obligation to shine a light on the most pressing issues in the business world. As of today, the Trump administration has imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian imports, with a 30-day exemption for the auto sector. Canada has responded in kind, with tariffs on around 30 billion of American imports and more to come. But the situation is fluid, and we can absolutely expect further policy changes in the days and weeks ahead. The upshot is that businesses and consumers are facing a period of deep uncertainty. In today's live session, we're going to discuss what this means for Canadian industries. What is the likely impact, short and long term, of a trade war? How should policymakers and business leaders respond? And how should leaders think about their role as we navigate these turbulent circumstances? To help us make sense of these questions and concerns, I'm thrilled to be joined by three leading experts from Ivey who are frequently quoted in the national and international press on this issue. Mary Crossan, Professor of General Management and Strategy, is an authority on leadership character and its impact on decision-making. Andreas Schotter, Professor of International Business, joining us from Hong Kong, is a leading voice on US-Canada trade relations and global economic shifts. Romel Mostafa, Professor of Business, Economics and Public Policy and Director of the Lawrence National Centre, is an expert on the policies needed to keep Canada competitive and innovative. Welcome, all of you. So we have record numbers attending. Over 1,000 people have signed up for this live event. We got a lot of questions in advance that we're going to attempt to address. We won't get through all of them, I can guarantee you that. And we're going to be taking questions as we go. So if you hear something that you'd like to add as a thought on or a question, please put it into the Q&A and we'll try to get to that question. We are recording this session and it will be available afterwards. So I'd like to get started. And we're going to start talking about the tariffs themselves. I mean, like many of you, like probably all of you, I am baffled, frustrated, choose your adjective, by the senselessness of these tariffs. We just find it really hard to actually make sense of why they have been imposed. And we're going to get to that. We're going to get to sort of sense making and what Canadian companies might do to respond. But let's start with where we are in terms of the immediate economic impact. Andreas, let me go to you first. Assuming these current tariffs stay in place for a few months at least, talk to us about the impact on Canadian businesses and consumers.
Yeah, thank you, Julian. Thank you for everyone for joining this. This is an issue I've been talking for a long time about the benefits of international trade and the opportunity here to bring us collectively in more prosperous times. So the impact on business in particular is, as you mentioned, a higher level of uncertainty about cost structures, the availability of resources, the availability of markets in a primary and secondary factor. So if it becomes more costly for firms to produce immediately, prices will increase. So there's an inflationary direct pressure on Canadian-made goods. That is mainly due, of course, to the counter tariffs in industries like automotive or for automotive manufacturers. This may be a multiple of factors. We don't know yet exactly how this pans out with offsetting some of these tariffs by going back and forth. It doesn't look like right now. And the second effect is that has been happening since November 30th. Our Canadian dollar has been dropping in value, putting further inflationary pressure, particularly on consumers who consume processed food, for example. Car prices are going up directly and indirectly. The rise in used vehicles is already happening. So there's a strong inflationary effect on consumers, and there's a strong inflationary effect on the inputs for firms, and on the other side, the competitiveness of firms. And when they stay in place, more firms will start to work on contingencies. For example, there's a snowplow manufacturer from Quebec who uses their rather smaller value add activity in the United States to assemble some parts that go into the engine of these snowplows in the US, but then distribute from the US even back into Canada. So untangling these kind of activities for firms is not something that you do overnight, and you don't do it back and forth. So the longer these tariffs stay into place, there will be more of a gravitation towards doing activities in the United States, which is a much bigger market, and duplicating activities in the United States and in Canada for firms is just not feasible. So what also will we see? We will see fewer product options for consumers in Canada in particular, but also in the United States. Take, for example, an automobile. If you decide to move the production from Canada and the United States, considering the stronger US dollar and considering that some of these raw input factors will also affect the production in the United States, there will be simply fewer models. They may manufacture only higher end, better margin models, and lower end models may not be available at all anymore. So it becomes very quickly very, very complex. But consumers will be better off. We're already starting to feel much poorer at the grocery counter, and this will continue on both sides of the border, by the way.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, and of course, consumers lose, businesses who are doing exporting lose. I guess at least in theory, there are additional tariffs. Sorry, tariff is a tax. Additional taxes go to governments, but that's relatively small. And that the intention of Donald Trump, perhaps we'll get back to this in a second, is to get Canadian companies to, essentially to move production south of the border. I mean, that's the kind of the logic that he is proposing, right?
One question I've been asked repeatedly again this week in some of the interviews about the investment in Canada of foreign firms, and this is the delta for us becomes much smaller to be attractive. Take, for example, the VW battery plant in St. Thomas, and even there's about 150 people working already in St. Thomas on the planning of the facility, but except for the raw material, which we still haven't, or raw earth in particular, we still haven't found a way to extract and ship to this facility really in significant numbers. Volkswagen may rethink the location of the factory, despite the record high $12 billion subsidies that are flowing. But the market is for the model they are trying to supply with the battery, the new Scout brand they purchased a while ago. That's in the United States. It's 9 times the market size, and in this EV SUV area, maybe even more than that one. So I could imagine if this keeps on going, companies like this foreign company will sit that out for a while. But at one point in time, they have to make a call, and you cannot ignore as a multinational firm the United States at all, right? So we see.
Thank you. No, absolutely. Romel, let me go to you now. I mean, Andreas has laid out the kind of in broad brushstrokes, but obviously not every industry is affected equally. Talk to us a little bit about, which sectors are worst affected, which ones perhaps are less affected.
For sure. I mean, Andres touched on the auto industry, and that's a sector that has 1 month reprieve, but the uncertainty itself is for reasons that what he spoke about is causing concerns about investments, right? And these are big investments we're talking about. Clearly, the export sectors that are directly linked to the tariffs will have a direct negative impact. So what are they? Of course, the autos are part of that. Steel and aluminum, right? If you think about it, right, they go into, in cars, as well as appliances and a whole bunch of other things, right? And much of that is produced also in the South, right? And so if you think about it, we've got 25% tariff on steel, and potentially another additional 25% starting from March 12th. That's going to lead to higher cost of, not only, as inputs going into the US, but also the finished products that are coming out of those, right? And we import some of that as well. Oil and gas, right? I mean, there's codependence between Canadian exporters, but the burden of tariff will likely, fall more on the Canadian oil exporters, given that, we haven't been able to diversify much there. Chemicals, that's another sector, but there's a chatter going on about potash may be exempted because in part because that goes into fertilizers that
Yeah.
farmers in the US need, right? So
Yeah.
we'll see how that plays out. Food and beverages, right? So we export about 70% of Canadian food and beverage products to the US. That's about $30 billion, right? And when you put in 25% tariff, the margins are now, right, pretty much gone.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a huge impact. Agriculture grains, that's another sector, right? And some of that actually, provide, meet the demand for the food and beverage sector. So they get impacted that way as well, right? So clearly these are several sectors that are going to get hit.
And what about sectors which are not hit? Because this tariff is a tax on physical goods. Canada's got a big service economy, financial services, many others. Is there any impact on services?
Sure. I mean, that's the spillover effect, right? If you think about if these manufacturing industries are not investing, right, they're shutting down, then that has a spillover effect, right, in the local restaurants, banks, et cetera, right? So that's a secondary impact that you're going to see. In terms of the gains, we could think about, the tariffs that we've imposed on some of the products, right? So wine, beer, et cetera. So that could bring in some, benefits to the domestic, producers of wines, spirit, and beer in the Canadian market, if you will. Now, there's also a push in Canada about buying Canadian products. So that's probably sparking some demand. Travel within Canada, but we're seeing more of that and less in the US, right? That could spur some of that activity here. But if we tally all that, I think gains are likely to overshadow the losses in the end, right? So there's
surely you mean the losses are overshadowing the gains?
Sorry. The losses are going to overshadow.
I mean, exactly. I mean, nobody wins in a trade war. I think we can all agree on this. And so there's a few bright spots, but mostly it's a bit gloomy. I'll go to Mary next, and then I'll come back to Andreas. Mary, I mean, given the unpredictability of the US leadership, I mean, we have to really watch, every day to figure out roughly what's going on because it changes so frequently. How should Canadian leaders approach negotiations to ensure some sort of sustainability or stability while standing up to our core interests? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a great question, and I love being on the panel with all of you guys that are talking about the what, how, and when. And so my attention is on the who. And, that administration is predictably unpredictable. And one of the things that we can pick up as we do, and I can bring this lens about, we know great leadership is about character, competence, and commitment. So we can actually do some behavioral forecasting based on the character side. So what I wrote this piece in Forbes about this idea that I think one of the problems when you deal with somebody who has imbalances of character, strengths in some areas, a lot of courage, a lot of drive, but maybe weaker humility, humanity, temperance, those kinds of things, those imbalances lead to uneven judgment, right, about how things are going to go. And one of the things then you can pick up is the worst thing you want to do in a negotiation is to exacerbate those differences. You don't want to amplify them. And we've already seen evidence of what happens in organizations when people amplify that. So here's a piece that, I mean, look at, in a lot of leadership, it's actually rare that we find those what I call compromised character, people who are not actually willing to change the character. And we do know character can be developed. So one thing I would say is where you're looking at leaders who are in the midst of negotiation, who have that kind of compromised character, we have to look for other players around them where we can activate on the character to see new possibilities, because it doesn't make sense, right? We know that. So in what cases can we start to influence the players who may be the ones that are going to help, deal with the negotiations that are at play? One thing I do want to pick up about this notion about character, there's a huge cost to this. And I want us to make sure that we don't fall into the same mistake that I think they're falling into at this point is you operate with an abuse of power where there's imbalances of power, and using your character in that way, leading to poor judgment, you lose trust. And that trust is not something that's easily gained back. So I think all of us, as we deal with this, is beginning to realize, how do we actually operate in this space with those allies that are once allies that were particularly powerful. And I'll return later, Julian, to how we as leaders can prepare ourselves a little bit better for that.
Yeah, thanks. One quick follow-up on what you just said. So obviously we get it that the huge unpredictability south of the border. How do you feel that the Trudeau government and Doug Ford as the provincial premier, how do you rate their response? I mean, it looks reasonably robust from my point of view. I mean, in terms of the way that they are dealing with the uncertainties that they're facing.
Yeah. It's look at it's a fine balance to follow, and it's a precarious situation. I think they've done quite well because you can't roll over on this. But on the other hand, you can't add fuel to the fire. So it's a very, very delicate situation, and I think we've had some good responses around it.
Yeah. I think Andreas and Romel, you both wanted to get in. Romel, go first, and then I'll go back to Andreas.
Yeah, no, I'll echo what Mary said. I believe historians will probably look back and remember Prime Minister has actually accomplished more in the last 3 months of his tenure, perhaps than the prior 3 years. Our government has responded generously, right? Committing to $1.5 billion in terms of, the improving the border security, right? And now key objective is to bring back, the discussion to negotiation at the table. And I agree with Mary, right? That, we need to reach out to those other folks, right? And build coalition across the border, right? So there are importers that are getting hurt in the U.S., right? There are, states, right, as a result of the, retaliatory tariffs that are going to get hurt too. So we need to bring that voices in play and use that as a way to bring back to the negotiation table and move for perhaps a USMCA 2.0, right?
Good. And well, I mean, let's come back to responses in a second. But Andreas, let me just go to you on this broader point. I mean, Romel just mentioned US, CUSMA, CUSM. I guess it depends what order you want to put the letters in. But the trade agreement between Canada, US, and Mexico. Andreas, I mean, do you think that this is sort of the end of that? I mean, I want to kind of broaden it back out to the bigger picture. Several of us are trained in business economics. We all understand the notion of comparative advantage and free trade. Are we seeing this break down as a concept?
Yeah, unfortunately, it looks like. I hope that the agenda that is behind that is, from a business economics perspective, really doesn't make any sense looking at either side of the border here. What makes sense will prevail eventually. I don't see this. There seems to be a strong notion of a agenda at the president level, and we all learned how much power an U.S. president appears to have, so much more than in other democratic systems. And this is different from the Trump 1.0 period, when there were people around him that had not a partisan or not a authoritarian agenda for whatever reason there is. I was, for example, shocked that Tim Cook was sitting in the background of this inauguration, a person from California, a gay executive who comes actually from a rather liberal area in the United States and from a more liberal community, and representing basically the Trump, the company at the physically at the Trump inauguration. But let me go back to one point that I think is important. I changed my perspective on the countermeasures. When this all started end of November, I said, don't scare the horses here quite yet. Let's see what really pans out for the economy, because the countermeasures are the first ones consumers and businesses will feel, right? At least those operating within our Canadian borders, the exporters may feel it earlier, and there's a differential whether you export something that's really needed in the United States, like potash or the energy, for example, or certain parts that cannot be replaced yet. But I have to say the countermeasures were the right decision, even it's very painful. But I don't think it is enough at this point in time, the countermeasures. Take, for example, a restaurant business that makes a lot of money on high-end liquor, right? Because the margins are much higher.
Yeah.
They may buy Canadian, but the margins are lower, or the consumers may not switch back. Now, we have seen in the LCBOs of this world that American products are taken out of the shelves, and some bourbon manufacturers from the US have been called about it. This really hits us more. That's off the shelf than the 25% tariff. But when you look at that, for the bourbon manufacturers, Canada makes about 1% of their sales, right, for most big ones. That is really not significant for the manufacturers, right? It's not nice to have the Canadian market, but this differential in size it's a business, but it's a problem. But the restaurant has a problem, right? The restaurant, people will not come in, people feel poorer, they will not eat, and you're actually, with this boycott of American product, may harm Canadians directly. But I still would say today that the Buy Canadian notion, the Buy Canadian call, and the counter tariffs are the right thing to do to enter long-term structural change, going beyond the complacency that we have shown for a long time and just being fine that the US is there and we have not diversified international trade or value creation activities much beyond the US. We are today at a much greater dependence level on the United States than we were 8 years ago.
Yep. No, I mean, I think many of us, I mean, certainly I'm one of them, agree that having these countermeasures, these very robust counter tariffs, is the right way forward. And Trudeau's been very clear. These tariffs stay on as long as there are tariffs on Canadian products going into the US. Romel, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so going back to the multilateralism, clearly it's an attack, right? Trump's style of negotiation is with country by country, right? And he's ignoring the very agreements that he championed and signed, right?
Yeah,
I mean, so he's uprooting those multilateral, arrangements that we've seen. And I think from our own perspective, it is, to our benefit that we actually work with our Mexican partners to have coordinated response, right, on tariffs against the US. They're painful, as we said, right? But the idea would be to then bring it back for discussion for the next 2.0, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's an economic shock. COVID was a huge shock on many levels, and we all kind of got through COVID. I mean, most of us did. And to some extent, having gone through that very difficult period starting in 2020, it feels like we're almost a little bit better prepared this time to say, yeah, there's going to be some pain here. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And then, I think to Andreas' point, there's been complacency for sure in thinking about, how do we really diversify our trade infrastructure and support that, right? In addition to it, also complacency even inward, right? Our productivity challenge, right? Some of these barriers that we have that we're not getting the most benefit out of internal trade, for example, right?
Exactly.
And I think we need to, talk about as well.
Good. As you say, I mean, it's well discussed, isn't it? That the interprovincial trade barriers, if we were actually to bring those down, would make a significant positive impact on all of us. Mary, I'm going to move to sort of how we start to respond in a second. Any quick observations on what we just discussed, or do you want to get into responses?
Well, it certainly gets into responses. I can kind of take some of these conversation into response.
Yeah, perfect.
So if I think about, my expertise around strategic agility, organizational agility, one of the things that we pick up is that all of that rests on individual agility. And the piece I've found over the 4 decades I've been working in this space is I can't get over how much is dependent upon the character of the individuals involved. So if we take a look at, we are at a state right now, I kind of actually like the fact that, that whole proverb, necessity is the mother of invention. Let's use this as a catalyst to be able to get to the level of competitiveness that Canada can be Why have those interprovincial trade barriers been there for that long? Because we had this easy market to the south of us. Now let's kind of look at this, and a number of people I've seen a bit even in the Q&A. It's like, how long can we last? What can we do? Well, take a look at Russia and the Ukraine. When you get the will of people saying, let's step this up, we got to think about how to diversify with respect to our strategies. We've been complacent about how we've operated. So organizations now need to think about strategically what is the portfolio that they've had, what's the risk that they've been carrying by relying as much as they've had on the US. That means that we have to look to our organizational agility, because this isn't just strategy. This becomes, what's our capacity to actually pivot and move. And the piece that I know for sure is that all of that rests on our individual agility. That means regulators. It means looking at policymakers. It is looking at education. It's looking at business. How do we all kind of lean into this to say, can we come up with better solutions than we've ever had before?
Oh, you like the rest of us were kind of reflecting on what happened during COVID and the need for us to be much more creative and to, as you say, be a bit more agile. Any particular lessons from that COVID period that we can specifically apply to this?
I think one thing that you start to, and I think that's why crisis helps on these things, it gets us focused on a common purpose, a common goal. And what happens when things have, been in the way they have with interprovincial barriers is because individual interests have dictated a particular position. But now if we can get a common interest, because we are in a position where we have to have a collective fight against this challenge that we face as a country.
Good. Let's open up for both Andreas and Romel on this issue of responses. By the way, I have a little bit of a feed of questions, and it seems that the New York Times, as we've been on air, has reported that tariffs on Mexico will be suspended until at least April. So there you go. Breaking news on the latest part of the story. So how to respond? Let me just feed you one piece of data, and then I'll get both Romel and Andreas in. We asked, and 1,000 people responded on LinkedIn and Instagram to the question about what should Canada do about the tariffs. A very, very simple survey. 25% of people said we should retaliate with tariffs of our own, which obviously we're doing. 20% said negotiate a new trade deal. 52% said diversify trading partners. 3% said do nothing and wait. So, I mean, interpret that as you see fit. That's not a completely surprising set of answers. But who wants to go first on the response that we make? I'll go with Romel, and then I'll go to Andreas.
And I think these are not mutually exclusive, right? And I think all three make sense, right? I mean, retaliation, negotiation, and diversification. And going back to, I think maybe I'll piggyback on Mary's comments about businesses, right? Through COVID, we've learned quite a bit in terms of scenario planning, for example, right? I think we need to bring that back, right? Tools that can help us plan, spot, prepare potential downside risks as well as opportunities, right? I think that should be part of our toolkit here. And also, for businesses, I think we should also think about what we can also control, right? Innovation in workplace productivity, right? To improve productivity. And so, productivity is not about cost cutting. It's actually about producing more with the same resources, right? And across industries, even some of my research would suggest that more productive firms grow larger, become more globally competitive than less productive firms, right? And that's how you can actually now have, pricing power, if you will, right? And actually, if you think about costs, right now, because you're productive, you can actually have potentially trade with other countries that even have further transportation costs, et cetera, right? And so these are some of the things that I think we need to really push for from the firm level. Clearly, on the policy side, there's a lot that we can talk about.
Yeah. So so, I mean, just to push a bit further, and then I'll go to Andreas. I mean, diversifying beyond our relationship with the US. Yes, I think everyone gets that. Something like 72%, I think you told me yesterday, of our exports go to the US that is completely over-dependent on one country, albeit one that, for many, many decades was incredibly stable and supportive. So the argument is, and of course this is going to vary by industry, is that we should be actively seeking out some of these other markets, Europe, Asia, whatever. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, absolutely. Right. Now, there is a reason why there is this trading partnership between US and Canada, right? Because of the comparative
this
natural
physical proximity is always going to drive trade relations.
That's going to drive that. So that's hard to beat. Let's put it out there, right? And that's how we've had this economy for so long a period of time, the structure essentially. But clearly, from a diversification perspective, I think there's quite a bit to be done on the policy side in terms of connecting our businesses to place their products in new markets, connecting them to the importers, right, through trade shows. Andres, touched on some of that early on, right? Delegations meeting with, meetings, and EDC, for example, can help, right? Our trade committees can become more active in that process. Now, all that takes time, right?
Well, that's the trouble, right?
That's the trouble, right? There are also, we have a lot of trade policies, right? And are we really taking advantage of that, right? We have more than 14 major trade agreements, right? The challenge is that there's also some what we call non-tariff barriers, right? And these are not just tariffs. There's potentially could be no tariffs, but, right, you may be unable to sell pork to the EU market because the way we raise and process pork, and the EU has different requirements that don't fit with ours. So we need to actually work and negotiate on those things with our other partners as well.
Good, thanks. Andreas, you've probably got quite a few thoughts on this big question about how to respond. Please add your perspectives here.
Yeah, I think we need to see where Mary initiated this kind of thought, individual, organizational level, and national level responses. Let's stick a bit to the individual level. For me, these are actually very exciting times, right? About 2 years ago, the term deglobalization came into play. And when you have on your description as professor of global management or global strategy, you think, oh my God, global is going away. It's not going away. These are the times when you need more competencies. This is a time where expertise and learning really takes effect, how you respond in a much more surgical manner, how you maintain the agility to pivot, to maybe change a decision that is right today and keep it an option for you to pivot back to the previous situation. But very specifically here for Canadian companies, yes, I agree 100% with Romel that our national trade organization need to do more to facilitate company-to-company, organization-to-organization connections around the world. This can go only so far. We also need a structural response within Canada. For example, the interprovincial trade barriers cannot exclude certain products. Canada as a country has a national brand. We are respected, we are considered friendly, it's nature. Many people regard Canada as one of the most desirable places to go to in the world. And that's a national brand we can leverage. So I don't understand why we ship, for example, produce and crops and so on to the United States to buy them back then in a process way at a much higher cost. We could start our own food processing industry and look for specific export markets. So this is nothing that happens overnight, of course. This will take a while, but this is the kind of complacency that I was talking earlier about. We have to start changing as such. But at the individual level, let me tell you one more thing about Canada where we have a comparative advantage. Our population, 50% of our population has some kind of college degree. That's a much higher percentage than particular at the worker level in the United States. So the United States, even though Trump wants to attract jobs to the United States, they have about 2 million manufacturing jobs right now, not filled because they cannot find enough people at that level, at that wage level, who are willing to work at that wage level to operate modern machinery. Right, that's a big problem, and the replacement of the jobs will also be driven by the exponential change in technology. So there will be greater automation that you can that you can produce with fewer people. So there are a lot of flaws in this entire push towards, moving certain things across the border. The problem is our differential. So that is when we have startups, the pure investment power in, for example, AI startups is so much greater in the United States. And we have struggling situations in Canada where the Canadian firms are rather snatched up by US investors to a large extent before they can reach a critical level. So in their initiatives, there's initiatives around our alumni network that are working in this space in private equity, right? And there's a real opportunity right now actually to rally together and use these disturbances to create something that is more resilient, I would say.
I'm going to throw in a comment of my own, piggybacking on that, Andreas, because I did my doctoral thesis, at Ivey 30 odd years ago. I mean, that was when NAFTA was originally agreed. So I was, in Canada at the point. I mean, I went away subsequently, but I was at Canada at the point where the trade barriers were coming down, and of course that created a disruption of its own. I mean, ultimately it was a very positive disruption, but for a short period, a lot of companies in Canada, which had been branch plants of American multinationals, suddenly found themselves saying, oh my gosh, what is my future? And so they had to be very entrepreneurial in responding to that set of changes. And what we're saying in a strange way is that as tariff barriers go up again, once again, we've got to be a little bit more entrepreneurial to break from the status quo. I'll go to Romel and Mary, both of whom I think have got something to say on that. Romel first.
All right. So, I mean, going back to interprovincial trade, I think, some of these are pretty, if you look at it, it's egregious, right? It might sometimes, less costly to bring in wine to Ontario and package it and sell it here than actually to buy it from BC, right?
Insane.
And there are all kinds of barriers that we have created, across provinces that are really affecting efficiency, right? If we actually can knock those down, some studies would tell you can get about 3%, right? Increase in GDP. That's substantive, right? And so we need to work on that, and that helps our local, entrepreneurial startup firms to scale within Canada. On top of it, right? Great point on the innovation side too, right? We do have a good AI, ecosystem here where there are lots of startups, great companies creating solutions, and there are ways in which we can actually try to see how we can scale that, right? In terms of procuring some of the local AI, services for, government services and efficiency, for example, right? And how do we connect businesses and these firms, right, to think about potentially adoption and creating sandboxes, right? So there's definitely, a lot that we can do within Canada, for sure.
Thanks. Mary, I think you wanted to comment on at least one of the things we've just been discussing.
I'll say something that may not be popular to people, but this, if you want to call it crisis that we're in, actually, that old comment, we've met the enemy and it is us.
Right.
We can't just be looking at the US to say, oh gosh, look what pickle we're in here. Why did we let ourselves get into that? And why are those barriers there? Like, we can all say, well, we should be doing this. We should have done this. We should have done this. So my question keeps coming back to, why didn't we? And what has got in the way? And I'm going to go, keep hammering this notion. It's not because we lack the competence. We lack the character, we lack the courage, we lack the drive, we lack the, that sense of humility, humanity, temperance, justice, the whole 9 yards that we talk about that lead to great judgment, that will lead to the innovation, that will lead to the competitiveness. And it is not just the government or just regulators or just an organization. It's all of us. So now is really the time to say, all right, let's kind of wake up on this one and see what we can do. Because I am pretty positive about where we could be as a country. I think, as you've all talked about, there's a lot that we have that really sets us up well for that kind of productivity and innovation that we could have. And I think this is going to give us that kind of wake-up call that we need.
Yeah, got it. So we've talked, I think, a lot about how businesses should be responding. A lot of talk about entrepreneurialism and diversification and so forth. And I will, before we finish, ask each of you for your kind of wrap-up advice. But let me just make sure we've covered off the policy issue. And perhaps this is more to Romel or Andreas. I mean, we talked a bit about this, but what are the levers of policy that the government has at its disposal that can, I mean, nothing's going to help us in the short term in terms of the short-term pain, I get that. But what are the levers of policy that the government should have at their disposal, and which ones should they be working on?
Right.
Yeah,
You want me?
Romel, go for it.
Okay. I'm actually going to borrow your metaphor of twin engines, by the way.
Okay.
All right.
You might have to explain what a twin engine is.
So the engine one, the idea would be that, we have to keep on negotiating to prevent an escalation for sure.
Right.
Build alliances with stakeholders in the US to push back against, tariff wars for sure. And develop a plan to cushion the impact of our economy if the tariffs are imposed, right? So as they're getting imposed, we need to have some cushioning there. So that's the one engine that we need to focus on for sure. The other engine is what we've been speaking about, which is eliminating inter-provincial trade barriers. This is not going to be easy, right? But I think we are hearing, right, across provinces that there are some momentum along that, and this is an opportunity to really push through it. The time is today. And then of course, leveraging our trade agreements, that's going to be another one. Streamlining permitting, building critical trade infrastructure. I think that's going to be important. And we have to be very disciplined about our fiscal spending, right? And we have to prioritize productivity enhancing investments. Those are going to be the more.
Yeah. So fiscal and monetary policy, I mean, fiscal meaning we should be spending more in targeted areas. Monetary policy, we should be easing off on interest rates, or?
Well, so the complication arises because, if we get into a full-blown trade war, right, and this creates both, decline in GDP and higher inflation, then the monetary policy becomes, impotent to some extent, right? Because if you lower interest rates, then you can try to push GDP out, but you just make inflation worse. On the flip side of it, right? If you increase inflation, your GDP goes down further. So there might be less maneuverability from the monetary policy side. More should be on the fiscal side. Now, in the short term, it's going to create a lot of uncertainty. And if the tariffs are not being imposed and, we're not seeing inflation, then you might see a potential rate cut.
Understood. Good. Andreas, your thoughts on policy levers?
Yeah, I'm, basically borrowing something that can't come from one of my former appointments from the Thunderbird School of Global Management that came when I was there. The mantra of the school was borders frequented by trade, seldomly soldiers. And I can really prescribe to that. And we see that these trade wars coming with even physical conflict that spills over to the character piece, but it also spills to something very important. On the policy side, I agree 100% with all of you on that one. And the limited ability we have here on the business and individual side, we have to change. Agile means that we are remaining agile. Agile is not a stochastic one-time event that we are right now to adjust to the new normal. The new normal is a white water that is constant. And that means we have to change in the business world today in an economic environment from scalable efficiency thinking, which we have done, right? Scalable efficiency is to rely on that US market, which makes total sense, still makes sense to a large extent, to scalable learning. So do we do really scalable learning? Do we really look over at what is broken open right now in the European Union, for example, which is a institutional beast that has put quite a heavy burden, this ginormous ocean freighter or tanker that is the European Union, to turn that around. This will take 5, 6, 7 miles before you can turn directions. We need to be much more agile, fleet of speedboats, you can say, to navigate through these waters. And there's an opportunity. And this is not something the policymaker should foremost do. This is actually on everyone, as Mary said at the very beginning, at every level. But what we need to do is be comfortable with feeling uncomfortable for a while.
Right.
This is reality right now. We can feel uncomfortable because of the imposing of these tariffs and these economic effects that are happening throughout that, or we can accept certain discomfort as a nation, as a business, or as an individual to change our trajectory so that we are better off in the future than today. So this is actually an exciting time for someone who's in the learning business like all of us, right? Because there's a real opportunity.
Mary, you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah,
I'll
be quick because I know you want to get to the Q&A.
Yeah.
To me, it's not even just policy, but sometimes we discredit some of the efforts of our government about things. But think about this. What started this in the first place was around fentanyl, right? There's all sorts of debate about the stats and this and that. But I get to do a lot of work around character leadership with Canada Border Services Agency, the RCMP, our Canadian Armed Forces. And one thing I can assure you, it's not just a matter of policy, it's execution. The degree to which the investment that we're making in all of these very important facets, back to, Andreas, this multi-level systemic notion about how we're operating, that we can deliver, incredibly deliver at the highest level on the various things that are at stake here in terms of course correcting around this.
Thanks. I'm looking at questions. There's one specifically for you, Mary. I'm not sure if you can answer it. When the folks surrounding the POTUS, the US president, may well be even more radical than he is, how can you gain a toehold and bring about moderating influences? I mean, you may want to answer that in a slightly more generic way. I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, look at it's very tricky. Certainly situation around what holds people in power and influence around this kinds of things. There are people if you want to call it, are holding their powder for what it is that they're doing. So I don't think we can assume because somebody hasn't spoken up that they don't, that they are in agreement. So it is a frustration, I know, to a lot of people to say, why aren't there more speaking out about this? But I do think back channels are a great way that work can get done without it necessarily being publicly out there. And I think we have to continue to work those channels to start to affect the kinds of change that we need.
Got it. Here's a question. The message we as Canadians keep getting is that tariffs will increase prices for Americans. It seems as if they were hearing the same, if they were hearing the same message, they would be angrier. Why aren't we seeing the American outrage about price increases? Anyone want to have a go at that? Perhaps it exists and we just aren't hearing it. I don't know. Andreas?
Yeah, I think this is actually very worrisome because if you go back to Trump 1.0, you saw a much stronger response. And I mentioned Tim Cook's presence even there during the inauguration. I think the messaging here is worrisome because it comes from a totalitarian perspective, from a leader that is creating some fear and discomfort with the general population, and the lack of acceptance of facts, or even the efforts to really understand the different facts. And I try to be sympathetic for what we will call Trumpists in that regard. Yeah. And, I'm not blankly dismissing the competency, intellect, and intention of that one. Some people may very well feel represented. And we just had that in my original home country while I carry 2 passports. But in Germany, we just had a rise to the second strongest party by a right-wing party, really, and you need to understand this. And when you talk to people, this is 1 in 5 people in the room voted for the AfD. So this is significant. So you cannot assume that these are all just Nazis or people who are not well informed or educated. This is not the case. So understanding what is behind this, is this a protest reaction? Is it potentially someone who feels certain things closer? Same as for trade, right?
Exactly.
And we have the responsibility to inform better, to understand this better. On both sides. That's why I mentioned before, the restaurant, the Canadian small business that relies on liquor sales of American whiskey is actually directly hurt by the fact that the whiskey is more expensive to import, or that we encourage them not to sell that product anymore, right? They may go out of business there. Do we really understand this, that this is happening to Canadians? If we boycott US products on the shelf, do we understand that we are maybe jeopardizing retail jobs of Canadians in Canada? It's not that trivial, really. And this openness to understand both sides goes to the point of character, was what Mary alluded to earlier, or very strongly.
Romel, quick response, and then I'm going to move towards the concluding section.
So, we've been interviewed by American journalists too, right? And I've asked them the question, right? That why are we not seeing more conversation around that? One of them basically said, frankly, there's so much going on out there, right? In terms of other issues and all that, that's not been featured, right? So I think I want to go back again. We got to work with, the governors, right? The industries within the US that are going to get hit hard, right? And really amplify that message. It needs to bubble up. So that's one. The number two is very quickly on, in terms of prices, it will depend on the substitutes that are available, right? In some cases, we may actually, the tariff burden may fall on us, right? And so the price may not pass through to the US consumers 100% of the tariff value, so to speak.
Yeah, got it. Yeah. Now, as you say, I mean, there's so much going on. I also still have a news feed from the UK. Tariffs is not even a top story in the UK, in Europe, right? They're much more concerned, understandably, about Ukraine and about Gaza than, somewhere in the background, it's just a minor story. So you're right. We have to understand that for a lot of people, there's so much stuff happening that this is not necessarily front and center. So look, we're going to wrap up in a second. I'm going to ask each of you for some concluding thoughts. Before we do, I just want to pull this back to Ivey for a second, because, obviously as a world-leading business school in Canada, we watch what's happening around the world with some trepidation. Of course, Ivey is not hugely sort of upset by, not directly by these tariffs, because we're a service business, we're not a product business. But I do take it very seriously, the need for us to take the advice that you've actually been giving us here, which is we have to diversify ourselves. We have to be absolutely much more proactive about having a presence around the world. And one of my big pushes, as you all know, is to try to get that Ivey brand better known in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas. And so I do feel that the advice you're giving me today as Dean is actually quite useful, because I think we do have to be a bit more entrepreneurial, a bit more proactive to make sure that, a very good brand in Canada actually has almost rises above the specifics of the day to become global and robust and stable. So I'm going to ask each of you to give us a couple of thoughts. I mean, it's been a little bit gloomy. It's hard not to be gloomy on this, but I want perhaps one specific thing we should be doing, either as business leaders or as consumers, and then one positive we can take out of the current situation. What is the silver lining to this cloud? Mary, can I ask you to go first on this one?
Sure, because I am immensely positive about this. Look, I feel there are people who are this is going to be hit harder than others right now, and this is not to dismiss that, but the fact that the way forward, for me, as I look at this, is we saw this in 2008 with the global financial crisis, the call to elevate character alongside competence that leads to both sustained excellence and well-being. And we really need to double down on that. There's lots of potential in Canada to be able to be stronger than we've ever been competitively around it with innovation. And I really feel the call here is to break down those kind of barriers. And a simple question I ask to people, are you part of the problem or part of the solution on this? What can everybody do to lean in across these levels to collaboratively work to allow us to achieve the potential that we can?
Right. Thank you. Andreas, what are your concluding thoughts?
Thank you. Before I do this, I would like to really apologize to the many questions that are popping up. I have been trying to answer some of them, but I invite everyone who wants to discuss that further to reach out to me. Certainly my colleagues might do the same, but you need to speak for yourself to keep this conversation going. As such, we don't have a crystal ball, but one thing is clear. This is a great time for the learning opportunity? Do we break open this complacency at the individual level? Because with more information, with more data, and with more options that we really think about from our position, we may find a way to respond to this one. So I echo what Mary said here in particular, and we need to have more voice. And we need to learn again, and this as a German with a very direct kind of culture where I come from, a discourse is not necessarily a conflict. You know, disagreeing on certain things helps us actually to understand things better. And we are falling too quickly into the trap to blame, for example, in this case, President Trump, and discounting that he is actually a smart person. Actually, he has been called dumb. I refuse to believe that someone who gets elected president of the United States is inherently a dumb person, right? There may be other very significant character flaws here, right, that are not good, but I doubt this. So I also don't want to push the discussion whether he's dumb or smart to one side, but we need to start understanding the other side much better and have open discursive conversation, even with those people we disagree with, because this will help us forward. This may sound a very high level recommendation, but it is not. This is happening at the dinner table. This is happening at the hockey game. This is happening everywhere. And this is something we need to start learning again, having a functional discourse on these things to jointly develop a way forward. Because it jointly, this collaboration piece is the one that will bring us out of there. And be open to international much more, right? Be open to that one. International comes to us, or we are going international. That is still the future. Borders frequented by trade seldom need soldiers.
Thank you. Romel, your final thoughts, please.
Yeah, and like Andreas and other colleagues, we run the Lawrence National Center for Policy and Management here at Ivey, right? And we are, really looking forward to interacting with, various stakeholders. We already do it. So those individuals who have not been able to get your questions through, feel free to reach out. On, consumers, I think they've been already quite resilient, and this is something about Canadian consumers that I'm seeing already, the pulse that we're getting, right? And so kudos to them. In terms of businesses, I think the message is that let's not wait for the world or Canada to be ready, right? There's so much going on, right? We need to act, and whatever is within our control, we should do it. And we talked about scenario planning. We talked about, various other tools to think through, how to navigate through this process. What really gives me hope, I think, if you think about it, that Canada has actually a strong foundation for growth. And a lot of things we take for granted, right? We have abundant natural resources, robust legal institutions, exceptional human capital, right? We're basically, if you think about AI, substantive, right? Ecosystem that we have. Assets that we often, take for granted, right? There's a reason why Donald Trump sees, value in Canada. That's why he wants, right? I mean, if you think about it. And more importantly, Canadians from coast to coast to coast, right? They're unified and they're willing to make, sacrifices. And that gives us, right, a potential mandate, right, to break down some of these barriers that we've talked about to unlock our full potential. Those two angles.
I'm gonna stop you there, Romel, because we're right up against the deadline, and I don't want to overstay our welcome. So I'm going to make one final observation and then wrap up. Some of you will have seen The Economist magazine does a survey. They call it the Footloose Index, and it came out just after Christmas. And they rank countries in the world as to which ones are the most attractive for people who've just graduated, early 20s, to go to. And Canada came out number one on that list. And a lot of Canadians sort of forget the fact that the rest of the world actually sees Canada as a place that they want to go to. So let's not lose that. I mean, as Romel just said so eloquently, there's lots and lots of very positive things about this country. And obviously, we need to continue to build on that. That concludes this Ivey Impact Live session, Trade on Trial, What's at Stake for Canadian Business. I hope you found today's discussion as insightful and thought-provoking as I have. What is clear is that businesses and policymakers must be proactive, whether through diversification, policy responses, or reinforcing Canada's economic strengths, adaptation will be key. Understanding what character exposes the need to move beyond analyzing the trade wars in terms of cost-benefit analysis alone to one of considering the character underpinning decisions. A huge thank you to our panelists and my colleagues, Mary Crossan, Andreas Schotter, and Romel Mostafa, for sharing their expertise and perspectives. The trade landscape is shifting, and the choices we will make now will define Canada's economic future. To conclude, a recording of this session will be shared, so keep an eye out for that in your inbox. For other thought leadership from Ivey on current business issues, visit www.ivyimpact.ca. And as you exit the webinar, you will be presented with a short survey. We would appreciate if you could please fill it out. I'd also like to invite you to a special International Women's Month edition of Impact Live, Advancing Inclusion in Turbulent Times. On March 11th, a discussion guided by Ivey's Kanina Blanchard will be bringing together industry experts to discuss why equity remains a business imperative and how to drive lasting change. And with that, thank you, and I wish you all a great day.